Don't hurt my grandma. 10-year-old Marcus shielded his grandmother from a gang demanding her disability check. A Hell's Angel named Grizzly stepped off his bike and froze. His glare sent them running. He knelt, asked her name, and learned they lived in a condemned trailer. Stay right here. Exactly 24 hours later, 300 motorcycles rolled in, not for trouble, but with money, lumber, and a life-changing offer. The boy thought he was protecting her. He had no idea he'd summoned an army. This is East St. Louis, a place where forgotten people disappear. 10-year-old Marcus and his grandmother, Miss Clara, were exactly that, invisible. No heat, no safety, no future, until one desperate cry on a street corner reached the ears of a Hell's Angel named Grizzly. But the true miracle wasn't the man who stopped. It was what rolled into town exactly 24 hours later. To understand what happened on that corner, you have to understand the world Marcus was born into. He was 10 years old, but he'd never been a child. Not really. His father was shot dead when Marcus was 3. His mother got picked up on a possession charge a year later and never came home. So his grandmother, Miss Clara Willis, stepped in. She was 67 years old with arthritis so bad her fingers curled into permanent claws. But she took that boy in without a second thought, and she raised him on a disability check that came to $845 a month. They lived in a trailer on the east side, a single-wide with a condemnation notice taped to the door frame. The roof leaked. The heat had been dead since last winter, but Miss Clara kept it spotless. She hung curtains she'd sewn herself. She made sure Marcus did his homework at a milk crate table. And every first of the month they walked together to the check cashing store on North 18th Street. That walk became a ritual. But here's the thing, the walk was never safe. A local crew called the Castle Street Boys ran that block. They knew exactly when the checks came in and exactly who was too old or too young to fight back. For months, they'd been circling Miss Clara like wolves, testing her nerves, demanding a $200 monthly insurance fee she did not have. A week before it all happened, they broke Mr. Henderson's arm 2 trailers down for telling them no. So Miss Clara knew. She just didn't have a way out. The morning of September 15th, she counted her cash in the dark. After cashing the check and paying the water bill, she'd have $112 left for the whole month. She kissed Marcus on the forehead. They put on their coats and walked out into the cold gray light. At 2:15, they rounded the corner by the abandoned filling station, and 2 men in red bandanas stepped out from behind a rusted dumpster. One of them, the big one they called Tyrell, grabbed Miss Clara's arm and twisted it hard. The skin bruised on contact. Her grocery bag hit the sidewalk. Marcus saw that bruise spreading, saw the pain in her face, and something in him just snapped. He lunged forward, planting himself between the men and his grandmother, and screamed, "Don't hurt my grandma." At that precise second, a deep rumble shook the ground. A Harley-Davidson pulled up to the curb and a massive figure in black leather swung his leg off the bike. His cut read Hell's Angels. Marcus, blind with terror, mistook the stranger for another gang member and yelled again those same 4 words. The biker froze. His name was Grizzly. He was 6'5", 270 pounds, and had seen violence in a dozen countries. But he had never seen a child that small stare down 3 armed men. Grizzly didn't say a word. His eyes tracked from Marcus to Tyrell to the bruise forming on the old woman's arm. He didn't have to say anything. Tyrell recognized the patch, released Clara, and backed off so fast he nearly tripped over the dumpster. The gang evaporated. Grizzly knelt down in front of Marcus and asked the old woman her name. She told him. She told him about the condemned trailer, the broken heat, the months of terror. His face was unreadable, but his voice was soft when he finally spoke. He said only, "Stay right here." Then he mounted his bike and thundered away. Miss Clara and Marcus stood on that corner for a long time. They didn't know what else to do. They thought maybe he'd go get the police. They were wrong. Grizzly wasn't going to the police. He was going to his brothers, and exactly 24 hours later the ground would start to shake. Grizzly didn't ride back to a clubhouse full of criminals. He rode to a steel barn outside Collinsville, Illinois, where the Hells Angels Nomads chapter kept their bikes and their code. Inside, a dozen men were working on engines, drinking coffee, shooting the breeze. They weren't planning violence. They were planning a charity toy run for the Children's Hospital in Springfield. When Grizzly walked in, every man saw his face and went quiet. He was pale, not scared pale, the kind of pale that comes from seeing something too heavy to carry alone. He sat down, poured himself a cup of black coffee, and told them about the corner, about the bruised arm, about a 10-year-old boy who didn't weigh 80 pounds soaking wet but threw himself in front of 3 armed gangsters with nothing but his voice. He yelled, "Don't hurt my grandma at me, Preacher," Grizzly said to the chapter president, a former Marine named Hank Preacher Davis. He thought I was one of them, but he stood his ground anyway. That boy's got more spine than most men I've served with. Preacher listened without a word. When Grizzly finished describing the condemned trailer, the disability check, the way the old woman's hand shook when she pointed down the road to where they lived, Preacher set his wrench down on the workbench. It made a sound like a gavel. "What do you need?" Grizzly said. "Everything. I need brothers. I need materials. I need to show those 2 souls that someone sees them." Preacher nodded once. He didn't take a vote. He just picked up his phone and sent a single text to the chapter list. "Emergency call, 7 p.m. Bring your trucks." That text hit 42 phones in the metro area. But here's what you have to understand about the Hells Angels. The Nomads chapter isn't isolated. They're connected to every other chapter in the Midwest, and those chapters are connected to independent clubs, the Outlaws, the Iron Cross, the Rogues. By sunset, that single text had been forwarded 70 times. By midnight, 160 men had responded. By dawn, 300 leather-clad brothers from 4 states were loading lumber, drywall, power tools, and generators into trucks and onto flatbeds. They weren't starting a war. They were starting a construction project. At 6:30 the next morning, exactly 24 hours after Grizzly left the corner, the first rumble reached East St. Louis. It wasn't a sound. It was a vibration that rattled the windows of the condemned trailer and woke Marcus from a fitful sleep. He sat up on his pallet of blankets and looked at his grandmother, who was already sitting in her chair by the cold wood stove, her eyes wide. Neither of them said a word. The street outside was empty, but the ground was humming like a freight train was about to burst through the asphalt. Marcus crept to the window and peeled back the curtain. The road that had been dead quiet was filling with chrome and leather. Not 6 bikes, not 60. 300 Harleys in tight formation, 2 by 2, stretching back as far as his eyes could see. Behind them came a convoy of pickups and flatbed trucks loaded with everything you'd buy at a Home Depot times 100. Pre-cut lumber, boxes of shingles, pallets of insulation, 3 portable generators, a crew cab truck pulling a trailer with a brand new furnace wrapped in plastic. It looked like a military invasion armed with nail guns and 2x4s. The neighbors came out onto their porches. Some were scared, some were curious. Nobody in that neighborhood had ever seen anything like it. Tyrell's boys, who had been lounging on a corner 2 blocks over, took one look at the convoy and vanished. They didn't jam, they just left. At the front of the column, Grizzly pulled his bike up to the trailer and killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. Then one by one, 300 engines cut off, and all you could hear was the clank of kickstands hitting pavement. Preacher climbed off his own bike, pulled a rolled-up blueprint from his saddlebag, and walked up to the sagging front door. He knocked gently. Miss Clara opened it. She had a cast-iron skillet in her hand because when 300 bikers roll up on your trailer, you grab what you've got. Preacher looked at the skillet and then at her face. He didn't flinch. He said, "Ma'am, I hear you need a new roof, reliable heat, and a front door that locks. My brother Grizzly here says you fed him coffee and told him your story. So my brothers and I are going to build you a house, not fix the trailer. Build you a brand new house on a piece of land we already bought a mile from here in a quiet spot with a garden. No catch, no fee, just an apology that it took us 24 hours to get organized." Miss Clara's skillet hit the floor with a clang. She tried to speak, but her voice broke. Marcus slipped past her and stood staring at the sea of bikers. He was looking for the one face he recognized. When he found Grizzly, he didn't say thank you. He said, "I told you not to hurt my grandma." Grizzly knelt down to his level again. "I know, son. You gave me an order. I followed it. Now I've got 300 men who want to make sure nobody else ever hurts her either. That okay with you?" Marcus looked at the men, at the lumber, at the faces that society had told him to fear. Then he looked at his grandmother's trembling hands. He nodded once. That nod set off something no one expected. A cheer went up from 300 bikers that was so loud it broke windows 3 streets over. But the cheer masked something more complicated. Not everyone was celebrating. Because while Preacher was drawing blueprints in the dirt, a county social worker named Ellen Peck was already getting calls from neighbors who reported a biker gang invasion. And she was loading a file on Clara Willis, a file that said a disabled grandmother and a minor child were living in condemned housing with no heat, which by law meant she could remove Marcus from the home before the sun went down. The bikers didn't know that yet. Clara didn't know that. As the first hammers started swinging and the first footings were being dug, a different kind of clock was already ticking. It was the one that said, "In this town, the moment you get noticed, you also get watched." And Ellen Peck had a reputation. She'd removed 12 children from their families in the last year. She didn't believe in second chances. She believed in paperwork, and she was already on her way. Ellen Peck's sedan pulled up to the edge of the construction site at 11 o'clock that morning. She didn't get out right away. She sat in the driver's seat with the engine running, staring through the windshield at what looked like a military base built by giants. 300 bikers in leather vests swarmed over a freshly cleared lot. They'd already poured the foundation for a 3-bedroom house. A crew was framing the walls. Another was running electrical conduit. Somebody had set up a makeshift kitchen under a canopy where volunteers were flipping burgers and brewing coffee. It was the most organized chaos she'd ever seen, and it was being run by men with skull-end wings patches. She stepped out of the car with a clipboard pressed to her chest like a shield. She was 52 years old with thin lips and glasses on a chain. She'd been a social worker for 27 years and she had never once lost a removal case in court. She didn't lose because she didn't take chances. Condemned trailer, no heat, grandmother with severe arthritis and a fixed income. In her mind, this was a textbook case. She clipped through the mud toward the trailer, her heels sinking an inch with every step. Preacher saw her coming. He signaled 2 men to block the path, not aggressively but firmly. She didn't slow down. "I'm Ellen Peck from the Department of Children and Family Services. I have a court order to inspect this residence and assess the welfare of a minor child. You need to let me through." Preacher read the paper. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just said, "Ma'am, you're right. The trailer is condemned. That's why we're building a new house. By midnight, that boy won't be sleeping in an unsafe home. You want to assess his welfare. Come back in 12 hours. You'll find a finished house with a working furnace, a locked door, and a fully stocked refrigerator. You remove him now and you're removing him from the only family he's ever known because of a problem we are actively fixing." Peck's eyes narrowed. "The law doesn't operate on promises, Mr. Davis, Preacher Davis, Hell's Angels nomads, and this isn't a promise. It's an active construction site with 300 witnesses, 2 building inspectors who have already signed off on the foundation, and a local news crew that will be here in 20 minutes. You really want to be on camera removing a child from a grandmother who just got a free house?" Peck hesitated. The mention of news cameras caught her off guard. She knew the optics. Poor old black woman, disabled, raising her grandson, saved by a biker gang. If she pulled that child now, she'd be the villain on the 6 o'clock news. She flipped through the file. "I have reports that she can't provide adequate food or medical care." Grizzly, who had been listening from a few feet away, stepped forward. He pulled a folded document from inside his cut. "I had my doctor see her this morning. Blood work, physical, the works. She's anemic, needs iron supplements and a better diet, but she's not unfit. And we've already paid for a year's worth of groceries and a pharmacy delivery service. That enough?" Peck took the medical report. She read it twice. Then she looked up at the house taking shape behind him. "You can't just buy compliance. There are procedures. She needs to prove she can maintain this long term." "Then give her a chance to prove it," Preacher said. "Come back in a week. If that house isn't done, the fridge isn't full, and that boy isn't enrolled in a better school with a paid after-school program, you can do whatever you want. But you take him now, and you'll be separating a child from the only person who ever fought for him, while 300 people who are trying to help stand here watching. She looked at Marcus, who was sitting on a stack of lumber eating a burger with his grandmother. He was smiling for the first time in months. Clara had her arm around his shoulders. It was a picture of stability, not neglect. Peck's professional instincts told her to follow the book, but something else made her pause. Maybe it was the scale of the operation. Maybe it was the fear of bad press. Maybe it was simply that she'd never seen a response like this in 27 years. "I'll be back in 7 days," she said, handing the medical report back to Grizzly. "If any detail is out of compliance, I will remove him. No warnings." She turned and walked back to her car without looking at anyone else. As her taillights disappeared, Preacher let out a breath he'd been holding for 5 minutes. But the relief was short-lived, because Tyrell's crew had not gone far. They'd regrouped 3 blocks away and decided that if they couldn't hit the old woman, they'd hit the project. At dusk, while most of the bikers were eating, a brick wrapped in a threatening note smashed through the window of the construction trailer that held all the blueprints and permits. A second brick hit Grizzly's bike, cracking the fuel gauge. The note said, "You can't build a house while we're still here. Back off or next time it's fire." This wasn't just about territory. Tyrell had been running that block for years. He'd been extorting the elderly, and if this house got built, it would send a message that his power could be broken by outsiders. He couldn't allow that, so he escalated. The next morning, a crew arrived to find the fresh drywall in the kitchen kicked in and spray-painted with gang signs. The portable generator had its fuel line cut. Someone had poured sugar into the gas tank of one of the supply trucks. Grizzly found Preacher standing in the wreckage, his hands on his hips. "We need to solve this. We can't just build faster than they can destroy." Preacher agreed. But they weren't going to fight fire with fire. They were going to fight it with community. They moved the entire operation into overdrive. They set up floodlights and ran a 24-hour shift. The bikers, many of them military veterans, organized rotating security details that walked the perimeter all night long. They didn't carry weapons. They carried flashlights and cell phones, and every single one of them had the local police precinct on speed dial. But the real turning point came from someone they didn't expect. A 16-year-old kid named Deshawn, who ran with Tyrell's crew but had a sister living 2 streets over from Clara, saw the bikers feeding his neighborhood. He saw them giving away leftover burgers to hungry families. He saw them fixing an old man's broken porch steps on their lunch break. And he saw Grizzly, the same man whose bike had been vandalized, calmly sweeping up broken glass and saying, "Ain't nothing but glass. We got more." Deshawn made a choice. He walked up to Grizzly the next afternoon, hands in his pockets, scared but determined. "They're gonna hit the gas line tonight. Tyrell's gonna cut the main line before the hookup inspection. I heard him say it." Then he turned and jogged away before anyone could ask his name. Preacher called the police and the gas company. That night, 3 squad cars sat on the lot. Tyrell's crew circled twice, saw the lights, and peeled off. The gas line was hooked up the next morning without incident. The house got its certificate of occupancy 4 days later, a full day before Ellen Peck's deadline. But the escalation didn't end there. Tyrell, humiliated and seeing his grip loosen, made one last desperate move. He drove by during the move-in day, not to attack, but to file a false police report. He claimed the bikers had assaulted him. It was a lie, but it was enough to bring 3 patrol cars back to the lot while Clara was carrying her first box of belongings through the front door. The officers, who had been cooperative until then, now had a complaint on file and had to investigate. Marcus watched the officers walk up to Grizzly and Preacher with cuffs still on their belts. That's when Ellen Peck returned. But this time, she wasn't holding a clipboard. She was holding a camera. She'd spent the last week researching the Hells Angels charity work, toy runs, homeless feeds, disaster relief fundraisers. She'd interviewed Clara's doctor, the building inspectors, and the school that had just enrolled Marcus in an advanced math program. She'd even talked to Deshawn, and she'd realized something. This wasn't a biker gang hiding behind a house build. This was a community that had been abandoned by every system meant to protect it, and those systems had been shown up by a leather-clad cavalry. She walked past the officers, handed Preacher a document and said loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. The state has reviewed the complaint, the living conditions, and the child's welfare. We find no grounds for removal and we're closing the case. Furthermore, I'm formally commending your organization for community service. The complaint filed by Tyrell Jones has been dismissed as unfounded. She nodded at Clara, who was crying in the doorway. Welcome home, Mrs. Willis. The officers, embarrassed, holstered their cuffs and left. Tyrell's crew, watching from a distant corner, saw their last card fold. Within a month, Deshawn would be working part-time for a construction company owned by a club member. Tyrell would be picked up on an unrelated warrant. The Castle Street boys would splinter. And that's when the real change began. Not the change of walls and roofs, but the change that happens when a community realizes it doesn't have to be afraid anymore. The house wasn't just a house. It was a marker that said, you are seen, you matter, and if the world won't protect you, 300 strangers on Harleys just might. But the story still had one final twist, because when Marcus started school that fall, he carried more than a new backpack. He carried a lesson that would ripple outward for years, and it all started with 4 words shouted by a terrified boy. Marcus started 5th grade at Lincoln Elementary with new sneakers and a lunchbox that didn't come from a shelter. The house on Oak Hill Road was small but sturdy, 3 bedrooms, a porch swing, and a garden where Miss Clara grew tomatoes and collard greens. The furnace worked. The door locked. For the first time in his life, Marcus slept in a room where the ceiling didn't sag and the wind didn't whistle through gaps in the walls. His grades shot up. He made the honor roll by Christmas. His math teacher pulled Clara aside during a parent-teacher conference and said, "That boy has an engineer's brain. He could build bridges." Clara cried right there in the classroom, not because she was sad, but because nobody had ever said anything like that about her grandson. The Hells Angels didn't just build a house and disappear. Preacher established a local fund called the Marcus Initiative. Every month, the Nomads chapter set aside a portion of their charity ride proceeds to support families on the east side who were targeted by street gangs. They installed security cameras for elderly residents. They fixed broken porch lights. They walked kids to school. It wasn't charity, it was presence. And it worked. Within a year, reports of elder extortion in that zip code dropped by 60%. Tyrell's crew scattered. Tyrell himself got picked up on an armed robbery charge 3 counties over and never came back. Deshawn, the kid who'd warned Grizzly about the gas line, started working weekends at a motorcycle repair shop owned by one of the Angels. By the time he turned 18, he had a full-time job, a high school diploma, and a plan to open his own garage. Miss Clara's health improved thanks to the steady medical care Grizzly's doctor arranged. The arthritis in her hands was still bad, but a combination of physical therapy, better nutrition, and reduced stress made a visible difference. She started baking again, sweet potato pies that she'd sell at the little farmer's market the bikers helped set up in the vacant lot next to the library. Her picture ended up in the local paper. Grandmother finds new life after biker backing. The article didn't mention the Angels by name. Clara insisted on that. "I don't want it to be about the patch," she said. "I want it to be about Marcus. That boy saved me just as much as they did." The surprising detail most people never learned about Grizzly happened about 18 months after the build. A reporter from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch tracked him down for a follow-up. She asked why he'd gotten so involved. He was quiet for a long moment, then he pulled a faded photograph from his wallet. It showed a woman in her 60s with a little boy sitting on her lap. The boy was Grizzly at age 8. The woman was his grandmother, Estelle, who had raised him in a trailer park in Arkansas. He told the reporter that when he was 9, a group of men broke into their trailer and robbed them while he hid under the bed. Nobody stopped them. Nobody helped. The police never found the men. His grandmother died a year later from a heart condition that he believed was worsened by the stress of that night. He never forgot the helplessness. When he heard Marcus scream on that corner, he didn't see a stranger. He saw himself. He'd been waiting 43 years to stop what nobody had stopped for him. That revelation turned a local news item into a national feature. The story was picked up by the Associated Press and ran in papers from Miami to Seattle. Viewer donations poured into the Marcus Initiative. A tech entrepreneur from Chicago who'd seen the coverage anonymously funded 4 full-ride college scholarships for kids from East St. Louis. One of them went to Marcus. Marcus didn't just go to college. He went to Purdue, just like Naomi Tate in a different story, but this one was his. He studied civil engineering. In his sophomore year, he designed a footbridge concept for a class project, a bridge that would connect his old neighborhood to the park across the river, symbolic of the connection between forgotten communities and the rest of the world. His professor called it elegant and humane. A year later, he presented the design at a regional engineering conference and won first place. When he walked off stage, there was a man in a black leather vest standing in the back of the auditorium. It was Grizzly, who'd ridden 6 hours to see the presentation. He didn't say much. He just shook Marcus's hand, pulled him into a hug, and whispered, "Your grandma would sure be proud." Clara had passed the previous spring peacefully in her garden, with a trowel in her hand and the sun on her face. She had lived long enough to see her grandson choose a future she'd never dared to imagine. On the day Marcus graduated, a convoy of 50 Harleys rumbled into West Lafayette. They sat in the back rows of the stadium, leather vests and patches and beards among the families in suits and dresses. When Marcus's name was called, they stood and cheered. It was the loudest applause of the ceremony. The house on Oak Hill Road is still there. It's still the property of the Willis family. Marcus rents it out to a single mother and her 2 daughters at a price she can afford. The garden still blooms. The porch swing still creaks. And hanging above the mantel, in a simple black frame, is a picture of a 10-year-old boy shielding his grandmother with his body while a biker named Grizzly stands frozen in the background. It was taken by a neighbor's security camera, grainy and accidental. It's the only visual record of the moment everything changed. Beneath it, in Clara's handwriting on a yellowed note, are the words, "4 words saved us. Never underestimate what a brave heart can do." The ripple didn't stop. It never does. When you throw a stone like that into a pond, the circles just keep going. And every time they touch a new shore, somebody else picks up the momentum. But here's the thing that stays with me long after the cameras left and the news cycle moved on. It isn't the build. It isn't the money. It's the question that Corner still asks anyone who hears the story. And that question is a lot harder than it seems. What would you have done? If you were walking down that street, would you have stopped? Would you have seen a 10-year-old boy standing in front of his grandmother and recognized the shape of your own story? Grizzly said he wasn't a hero. He said he was just a man who finally found the moment he'd been waiting for since he was 9 years old. But that's the thing about moments. They don't announce themselves. They just show up on a street corner in the rain in the shape of a child's voice. And if you're not paying attention, you miss them. The house on Oak Hill Road still stands. The garden still grows. And somewhere out there tonight, another grandmother is counting change. Another child is afraid. Another stranger is about to turn a corner. The only question that matters is whether that stranger sees a threat or a human being. The bikers chose to see a human being, and because they did, a family got their life back. A neighborhood found safety. A boy grew up to build bridges. So I'll leave you with this. The next time you hear a cry for help, even if it comes from a place that makes you uncomfortable, even if the person crying looks nothing like you, ask yourself what it costs to stop. The answer might surprise you. If this story moved you, drop a heart in the comments. Share it with someone who's forgotten that quiet courage still exists. And subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because somewhere out there, somebody's still shouting into the void. Be the one who hears.